548, that's my money pit. Don't flex fake pay, no, let me take these wins. Flashing like a cheesecake, got a shiny grid. Money wide like a cake, I don't fuck with crates. What's a dim, mate? Eating 40k steak, I'm a cold steak.
So shortly after the last devlog, which was 3 months ago, I decided that I would start planning out my work on Trello to better manage my time spent on the game. And I gotta say, it's helped my productivity level quite a bit. My first task was to rewrite most of the player controller because it was overly complicated and contained many bugs that would require hacky solutions to fix. So after spending some time, I was able to come up with a better and simpler implementation.
The fuck is that?
Which made the player controller feel better while removing most of the bugs I was experiencing with the old controller. The new controller has a better feeling of momentum and in-air control, which existed in the old player controller, but were not very consistent in how they worked. I then started working on improving the magnet puller, which is the thing that allows the player to pull weapons away from enemies. It now has a cooldown, since without it you can break the game by quickly disarming all the enemies around you. So in order to use the magnet, there has to be enough charge stored up, which fills up at a constant rate, but will fill up faster the more the player moves. Currently, pulling weapons directly from enemies requires a full charge, while weapons that are not attached to enemies only requires half a charge. This way it adds a reason to throw your empty gun at an enemy, since you can grab their thrown weapon for half price.
Yeah, baby!
I also made an effect for the magnet puller that consists of a line renderer and a distortion shader. To make the shader I used Unity's shader graph, which is something I have no experience with, so I watched a 10-minute tutorial and then spent the next 3 hours just plugging shit in until I had something that looked decent. I also spent some time improving the underlying system for the AI. The AI used something that I call nav grids, which is basically just a grid of points that sit on Unity's nav mesh. The AI pathfind the points on the nav grid that are visible to the player, rather than pathfinding directly to the player. The idea behind this is that the AI try to make themselves visible to the player at all times, without chasing the player around like dumbasses. As a result, the AI in my game are highly advanced and very intelligent. However, one problem with the navgrid system is that sometimes enemies try to move to a point that is unreachable, and as a result, start doing some weird things. This was happening because of how the original navgrid system worked. Originally, you placed these areas around the level, and points would get calculated within those areas for the AI to use. Now with the new system, it's exactly the same, but now you can assign enemies to specific navgrid areas. So enemies will now only navigate the points within the area that they are associated with. In addition, I also made the navgrid tool more usable by creating a custom inspector where you can select, add, and delete specific navgrids. Before, if you wanted to select a navgrid to modify, you would have to click on the area, but half the time it would select the object behind it, which kept pissing me off, so I switched it to this. I also added event triggers that alert specific enemies whenever the player enters them, which allows for greater flexibility as to when the enemies start attacking the player. The same event trigger script can also be placed on doors that when destroyed trigger the specified event. For example, on this level, I placed an event trigger on this door that when destroyed will alert the enemies inside the room, including the ones behind this wall. So now when I break the door, the enemies in the room will start attacking, while the enemies behind the wall will run into the room. Wills, who is the artist for this game, made some more assets, so now we have a pistol, shotgun, and LMG. I also decided to add in some camera shake while firing to make the guns feel more powerful. Wills also created a new heavy enemy.
Hi sisters!
If the player decides to steal its LMG, it will then equip a shield and start shooting bullets out of its wrist gun, which is actually just a pistol that I stuck in his arm. The wrist gun kinda seems random, but the reason for it is I want the heavy enemies to always have a long range weapon, so they don't end up trying to punch the player like the default enemies. And the only logical solution I could come up with as to why the gun can't be stolen was by attaching it to its arm. There have also been changes to the default enemies where they will now switch to a pistol after having their primary gun stolen instead of switching directly to punching the player. The last feature I added were ziplines, which I don't think I've ever seen in a game before. I decided to have the magnet pull the player to the zipline, which turned out to be a mistake because it took me several hours just to calculate where on the zipline the player should fly towards. But once I had an end position, it was fairly easy getting the player to move along the zipline. And then I made a level.